November 15th, 1942. A Wehrmacht soldier sits in a makeshift barracks near Alamein, his radio hissing with static. It's late evening, and the desert around him pulses with an eerie quiet broken only by distant artillery. He adjusts the dial, searching for news from home, for some connection to the German broadcasts he knows and trusts. What crackles through the speaker sounds exactly right. The intonation is perfect. The accent is German. The music that frames the announcer's voice is unmistakably the Deutschlandsender. But something is subtly, profoundly wrong. The content is designed to make him question everything he believes about the war, his commanders, and his own survival. This was not a broadcast from Berlin. This was British propaganda so expertly crafted that it infiltrated the minds of hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, each one wondering if what they were hearing represented the truth his superiors were hiding from him. Welcome to the story of the German service, the most audacious and psychologically sophisticated propaganda operation of the Second World War. The innovation seems almost impossibly simple in retrospect. Instead of broadcasting obviously British counter-propaganda, the War Office realized that what truly demoralized soldiers was not foreign criticism, but doubt about their own side. If you could create a radio station that sounded, in every conceivable way, like an authentic German military broadcast, but gradually introduced stories of corruption, waste, incompetence, and futility in the Nazi command structure, you could achieve something far more devastating than any conventional radio address. You could make a man question the voices closest to him. You could transform a radio set from a source of comfort into a source of existential confusion. The German service represented the apex of a new kind of warfare, one that targeted not the body, but the certainty of the mind. To understand why this innovation was necessary, we must understand the failure of everything that came before it. In the early years of the war, British propaganda efforts had been crude and obvious. The BBC's German service, broadcast in German and clearly identified as coming from Britain, was dismissed outright by most German soldiers as enemy lies. Enemy propaganda was something to be expected, discounted, ignored. The Wehrmacht was not particularly vulnerable to obvious appeals to surrender or suggestions that the war was already lost. German soldiers had been indoctrinated for a decade with Nazi ideology. They had been taught to view British propaganda as a weapon of a declining imperial power desperately clinging to relevance. Simply telling them the war was unwinnable changed no minds. Soldiers who heard such broadcasts reported them to their officers, and listening to enemy propaganda was technically forbidden. But what if the propaganda did not identify itself as propaganda? What if it came dressed in German uniform, so to speak, complete with every authentic detail that might convince a listener he was hearing the authentic voice of German officialdom? The problem was psychological rather than military. By 1942, despite successive victories in North Africa and the Mediterranean, German soldiers had begun to experience something that no amount of ideological commitment could entirely suppress: doubt. The Wehrmacht had conquered vast territories but held almost none of it securely. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Officers were being rotated constantly. Rumors circulated about conflicts between the SS and the regular army, about corruption among the high command, about resources being diverted to pet projects while frontline soldiers starved. These doubts were real. They were grounded in observable fact. But they were also dangerous to voice openly. A soldier could be shot for defeatism. The officer corps was paranoid, fractious, and increasingly willing to punish any suggestion that the war might not be winnable. What was needed was not new information so much as permission to voice doubts that already existed in private conversations. What was needed was a voice that could speak with apparent official authority while articulating the unspoken fears that plagued every thinking soldier. Between 1942 and 1945, an extraordinary operation took root in Milton Bryan, a country house in Bedfordshire about 40 miles north of London. The location had been chosen deliberately. chosen because it was remote enough to be secure, but close enough to London to remain connected to the machinery of the war effort. Here, under the auspices of the Political Warfare Executive, a team of linguists, actors, journalists, and intelligence officers built the German service from nothing. The operation was staffed by Germans themselves, most of them refugees who had fled the Nazi state and carried with them an intimate knowledge of German military procedure, slang, and the particular cadences of German speech. These were not British amateurs attempting German accents. These were native speakers, men who had lived in the German military establishment and understood, with almost anthropological precision, what would sound authentic and what would sound false. The technical challenge was formidable. Radio broadcasts had to be scheduled to coincide with the movements of German military units. They had to be timed so that soldiers could access them at moments when they were gathered around radios in barracks or trucks. Every detail of the broadcast had to be meticulously researched. The forgers of this operation did not simply make up stories. They created narratives that wove real events, real orders, real military information gathered through intelligence channels, into a tapestry of half-truths designed to cultivate specific doubts. A Wehrmacht unit retreating in North Africa would hear a broadcast suggesting that their retreat had been bungled through incompetence in Berlin. An anti-aircraft unit would hear reports of corruption in the procurement process, suggesting that ammunition shortages were not the fault of supply lines, but of officials siphoning resources into private enterprises. The broadcasts had the texture of real military communication because they were real in almost every particular except the ones that mattered. The German service maintained a schedule of 4 to 6 hours of broadcasting daily, transmitting on multiple frequencies to reach soldiers scattered across different theaters of war. The programs included news bulletins that mimicked the style of the official Deutschlandsender almost perfectly. They included reports from the front lines. They included music selections carefully chosen to appeal to soldiers far from home. They included dramatic readings of letters allegedly from soldiers in the field, letters that spoke of hardship, of questions about the competence of the command structure, of longing for the war to end. The operation employed approximately 140 people at its height, and it was integrated into the broader intelligence apparatus, such that new information gathered by signals intelligence, prisoner interrogations, and agent reports could be rapidly incorporated into broadcast narratives. The genius of the operation lay not in falsehood, but in strategic truth-telling. The German service did not tell soldiers that the war was unwinnable in some abstract sense. Instead, it told them stories about specific failures, specific instances of corruption or incompetence that rang true because they often were true. It gave soldiers the opportunity to hear articulated, in an apparently official voice, the doubts that might have been unspoken but were far from invisible. It created a reality in which a soldier could question the competence of his command structure while still believing in the value of German military tradition, still maintaining his dignity as a soldier. In this respect, it was far more sophisticated than propaganda that simply insisted upon surrender or condemned the Nazi state. It operated within the framework of German military values and suggested that those values were being betrayed not by soldiers, but by the officers and politicians who commanded them. The broadcasts achieved their first documented successes in North Africa in late 1942 and early 1943. Prisoners of war captured after engagements in which the German service had been broadcasting reported that they had heard the broadcasts and that they had influenced their thinking, particularly regarding the reliability of orders coming from above. Intelligence officers conducting interrogations noted that German prisoners seemed to have knowledge of information that should not have been available to them, information that matched details from German service broadcasts. Some prisoners reported that entire units had gathered around radios to listen, that there had been debates about the authenticity of what they were hearing, that some soldiers had come to regard the German service as more reliable than official German military radio. The broadcasts were being captured, transcribed, and smuggled back to Berlin, where Nazi officials initially dismissed them as crude deception, but eventually recognized them as a serious security concern. The most significant theatrical deployment of the German service came in 1944 and 1945, during the campaign in Northwest Europe. As Allied forces pushed into France and Germany, German soldiers faced not only military defeat, but the collapse of the entire framework within which they had been operating. The German service broadcasts during this period took on an almost elegiac quality, speaking of the fate of Germany, the legacy that would be left to future generations, the moral responsibility of soldiers to preserve German military honor in the face of defeat. These broadcasts did not tell soldiers to surrender precisely. Rather, they suggested that the continuation of the war was destroying the very German values and traditions that soldiers purported to be defending. They created a space within which surrender could be reframed not as betrayal, but as a final act of loyalty to something greater than the immediate military command structure. Comparative analysis reveals how distinctly British this operation was. The Germans themselves experimented with propaganda of this kind, creating false broadcasts and propaganda materials designed to demoralize Allied soldiers, but they did so with considerably less sophistication and far more obvious falsity. German propaganda efforts during the war were often crude, betraying their origins through language choices, through assumptions about what would appeal to Allied soldiers, through a fundamental misunderstanding of the societies they were attempting to reach. The American military, meanwhile, developed propaganda operations of their own, but the American approach tended toward greater heavy-handedness, more reliance on financial incentive, and explicit promises of better treatment in captivity. The British approach, refined through centuries of managing vast multinational empires, demonstrated a more subtle understanding of how to operate within an existing cultural and linguistic framework rather than simply attacking from outside it. What made the German service fundamentally different from other propaganda operations was its acceptance of the internal logic of the target audience. Rather than attempting to convince German soldiers to adopt British values or American ideals, the operation worked within the framework of German military culture to suggest that the Nazi leadership was betraying the very values that culture supposedly embodied. This was a form of propaganda so sophisticated that it barely read as propaganda at all. It read as truth-telling, as an internal German conversation about the state of the war and the competence of the command structure. The fact that this truth-telling was being orchestrated by British intelligence only underscored how thoroughly the operation understood its audience. The actual historical impact of the German service remains contested among historians, and this uncertainty deserves to be stated clearly. No historian can point to a specific battle lost because soldiers had listened to the German service broadcasts. No precise figure exists for how many soldiers heard the broadcasts, though estimates suggest it ran into hundreds of thousands. What we do know is that the operation was taken seriously by German intelligence and military leadership. Significant resources were devoted to tracking down the broadcasts and locating their source. Officers conducted investigations into units that seemed particularly susceptible to the broadcasts. The Nazi regime clearly believed that the operation represented a genuine threat, and regimes do not devote resources to combating what they perceive as inconsequential threats. The psychological impact on soldiers seems to have been real, if difficult to quantify precisely. Prisoner interrogation reports from 1944 and 1945 frequently reference the broadcasts. Some prisoners reported that they had influenced their decision to surrender or to cease active resistance. Others reported that the broadcasts had created a sense of uncertainty about the reliability of information coming through official channels. Perhaps most significantly, the broadcasts seem to have contributed to a growing conviction among German soldiers that the war was lost, that the only question remaining was how one could maintain one's humanity and honor during the inevitable surrender. In a demoralized army, in an army where belief in final victory was crumbling, the German service broadcasts represented an additional voice suggesting that the time for surrender had already arrived, whether the command structure admitted it or not. The innovation influenced later developments in psychological warfare and military intelligence. The methods pioneered by the German service informed British and American propaganda operations during the Cold War. The principle of creating propaganda that operates within the target culture's own framework, rather than attacking from outside it, became a standard doctrine in military intelligence circles. The operation demonstrated that propaganda could be sophisticated, nuanced, and based on detailed understanding of the target audience rather than crude assertions of superiority or crude appeals to self-interest. Where surviving examples can be found today offers a peculiar kind of historical access. Some of the broadcasts were recorded and preserved in the BBC archives. Transcripts of the broadcasts exist in various intelligence files, now partially declassified. The Milton Bryan compound still stands, though it has been adapted to other purposes. Listening to the recordings today, what strikes one most forcefully is how utterly authentic the broadcasts sound, how completely they inhabit the world of German military culture. They do not sound like British propaganda made to sound German. They sound like Germans speaking to Germans, which is precisely the point. They sound like the voice of conscience, or perhaps the voice of realism, or perhaps the voice of the disillusioned insider who sees too much from the perspective of the command structure. November 15, 1942, and a soldier in a desert barracks adjusts his radio dial. In the months and years that follow, millions of German soldiers will hear broadcasts that sound like they might be coming from Berlin. Broadcasts that introduce doubt into conviction, that create space for questioning, that suggest that honoring one's military traditions and accepting the inevitable might be compatible rather than contradictory. The broadcasts will not win the war. Wars are not won through propaganda alone, but they will contribute to something that might be just as important: the psychological unraveling of an enemy from within, the creation of a space where surrender becomes not a betrayal, but a recognition of reality. The German service was the sound of a nation at war, learning that certainty is fragile, that conviction can be undermined not by crude assault, but by sophisticated appeal to doubts that are already present. It was propaganda so artfully executed that it barely seemed like propaganda at all. It was a weapon that targeted not the body but the mind, not the soldier's commitment to duty but his confidence in the officers who commanded him. When we speak of Britain's contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany, we think of the RAF, of the convoys that kept the island supplied through the darkest years, of the soldiers who fought in North Africa and Europe. But we should remember also the men and women who sat in a country house in Bedfordshire, who crafted words and shaped narratives, who understood that in modern warfare, the battle for reality itself might be the most important battle of all. The German service proved that a nation at war could be unmade not by force alone, but by the simple act of making its soldiers question what they had been told to believe.